Hello, my name is Ryan Borochovitz. I'm a PhD student at the University of Toronto, and the title of my presentation is Nonfictional Theater and Lepage's 887. Can a play be a work of nonfiction? Pose this question to your average layman. They will likely say something to the effect of course it can. I just saw Come From Away, which is a true story. Pose the same question to your average academic, and their answer will surely be more along the lines of no. A play will always be fictional because, by its very nature, it is an artistic construction and particularly one predicated on some degree of enacted illusion. However, surely, as most of us can agree, unless we rigidly subscribe to either end of the spectrum, as I have represented by these two anecdotal strawmen, non-fictional theater is possible, but more complex than simply being based on true events. Straightforwardly autobiographical monologues like those popularized by Spalding Gray have long been fringe festival mainstays. Documentary and verbatim plays have employed rigidly journalistic and historiographic composition techniques for the better part of 2 decades, if not earlier. To dismiss works such as these as being just as fictional as, say, Twelfth Night or A Doll's House does a disservice to the dramaturgical choices made by these artists. While I am in the process of a thorough theoretical inquiry into the minutiae of how such choices are made and to what effect as part of my ongoing doctoral research, of which this paper is only a small part, the aim of this presentation is far more modest, I will say. I will begin by asserting the value of a fiction-nonfiction dichotomy as a framework for discussing plays, as they appear on both page and stage. In so doing, I propose a light refutation to the phenomenologically influenced theories of the real in performance, which I believe to possess some validity in their own right, but are distinct from my narratologically-inspired concerns about the nature of fictionality itself. I will then proceed to outline a brief summation of my own working conception of how literary narratology can be applied to the question of drama and theater's fictionality, drawing primarily upon the theoretical contribution of Dorrit Cohn. I will then conclude by applying this narratological model of fictionality to an analysis of Robert Lepage's recent solo play 887, which I believe to be an exemplary case of a piece of theater meeting practically all of the necessary discursive standards for non-fictionality. To begin, a brief word must be said as justification of my own proclivity towards conceptualizing this question in terms of fiction versus nonfiction, rather than one of the more common and other available dichotomies that are frequently positioned as representing fiction and its opposite. 3 of these alternatives come to mind straight away: the real versus the fictional, fact versus fiction, and truth versus fiction. While each of these terms may appear to be validly antithetical to fiction upon first glance, a moment of further consideration reveals how loaded each one is, ultimately rendering them untenable as binaries of this kind. The real makes more sense in relation to the fake or artificial, both of which make for reductive ways of defining fiction, with the implication being that there's no possibility for real content within a fictional work. The same can be argued of fact, whose more proper opposite is falsehood, which would also suggest that a work of fiction cannot contain any factual content. Genres such as historical fiction are highly contingent on their content being factual, at least to some significant degree, despite commingling with counterfactuals. Truth, being the most philosophically loaded of the 3, brings with it a moral judgment in relation to its opposite being lie. Subscription to these 3 terms would inevitably send us down the Platonic path of viewing all poets as liars and consequently banishing them from the ideal republic. With each of these false dichotomies, fiction is better positioned within a third space between these extremities. Fiction is not consubstantial with lying because it's quite literally defined by the lack of a truth claim, by which any artificiality or falsehood found within make no intention of deceiving the audience. In response to these 3 non-starters, I choose to center non-fictionality as fiction's opposite, the binarism of which is baked directly into the nomenclature. These terms are best used for categorizing literary or otherwise narrative representations. At their core, they are used to connote sections of the library, aimed at setting the reader's horizon of expectations as what they can expect to find in the work in question, and how they are expected to use it. The dividing line between these two comes down to whether or not the author makes a truth claim, which will govern the type of discursive composition that is capable of upholding that claim or lack thereof. This distinction has been mapped out by various literary scholars working within the subdiscipline of narratology. First, however, it should be noted that despite how frequently theater theorists like to talk about fiction, they rarely do so in relation to nonfiction. Much more common within this field are discussions of, quote, the real, end quote, discussing the interplay between a performance's narrative fiction and the material reality used to enact it. This perspective finds much of its foundational roots in the phenomenology of Bert States, who draws attention to various, quote, upsurges of the real, end quote, that come into conflict with the play's fictionality. These include working clocks on stage, running water, fire, children, and animals. This theory has been adapted for 20th and 21st century audiences by, among others, Carol Martin, whose conceptualization of theater of the real includes a wide array of contemporary performance styles, all of which are characterized by a hybridity between the fictional construct and the performative gestures toward reality. In all honesty, I find very little to disagree with in both of these scholars' work. My only point of contention, however, is that, contrary to popular belief, what States and Martin are describing is not the same as my own formulation of non-fictional theater. While they presuppose a baseline fictionality that becomes disrupted by upsurges or eruptions of the real, my aim is to identify works that are non-fictional through and through, and thus cannot fall victim to disruptions of this kind. The schism lies in their reality being an ontological state, whereas by non-fictionality, I mean a genre of narrative discourse. If we intend to approach plays from non-fictional conceptions of narratological conceptions of fiction and non-fiction, it stands to reason that we must ask how it is that narratologists define those terms. Although, like practically everything in narratology, there is a great deal of debate and no clear consensus between theorists, an approach offered by Dorrit Cohn satisfies our needs for the present inquiry. She offers 3 textual signposts for distinguishing a fictional narrative from its non-fictional counterpart, which can be summated as follows. 1, nonfiction must be analyzed on 3 levels, referent, story, and discourse, whereas fiction requires only 2 levels, story and discourse. 2, nonfiction cannot present events through the eyes or minds of figures on the scene. They can only do so through the author's own eye and minds, as the backward-looking historian narrator. Fiction has no such limitation. And 3, in nonfiction, the author and the narrator are one and the same, otherwise phrased as A equals N. In fiction, alternatively, the two are marked as being separate figures. A does not equal N. Although each of these signposts can be a fruitful site of analysis in their own right, I would like to turn our attention primarily to the third. It is my contention that, with only slight modification that by no means compromises the essence of Cohn's model, the core point being made by invoking the other two can just as easily be explained by the third. The result is a streamlining of Cohn's model into a single signpost, which can thus be applied to given case studies in a more elegant fashion. The source of this variation is rooted in what we mean by author and narrator respectively, which will dictate how exactly the two are equated in a non-fictional context. So, to pose a decidedly Foucauldian question, what is an author, at least in this specific context? For the purposes of this analysis, my conception of author, or A, in these equations, refers not explicitly to the signature that takes legal responsibility for the work by appearing on the cover page of a printed text as formulated in the theories of Philippe Lejeune or Gerard Genet, or those that appear as same on the playbill of a performance. Instead, I use the term to connote the real-world agent who is responsible for the verbal composition of a given piece of discourse. By this definition, the vast majority of fictional works are characterized by the singularity of their authorship, in which the proper name associated with the signature likely is responsible for composing all that is said therein, despite the potential plurality of speaking characters, in which the discourse becomes fragmentedly distributed in the form of fictive dialogue. Conversely, non-fictional works, via their frequent use of referential quotation from documentary and otherwise external source material, must be understood as possessing a multiplicity of authors, in order to distinguish the overarching author of the text of the text's connective tissue from the quoted authors of individual passages, regardless of whether the latter is initially authored textually or orally. The key exception to this multiplicity is the genre of autobiography, which remains non-fictional by virtue of the singularity of its authorial speaker. With this modification in hand, we can see how Cohn's first two signposts can be subsumed by the third. In signpost 2, separating the authorial historian narrator from the quoted authors whose attributional stance allows them to speak for themselves, allows both quoter and quotee to be their own authors and narrators. However, by not presuming what historical personages said or thought off the record, all passages that do appear within the text of a non-fictional narrative remain narrated by their original authors. By this same logic, Signpost 1's documentational basis for referential comparison is likewise governed by the attributional quotation, as was just described in relation to Signpost 2. So long as every real-world speaker is treated as the author of their own speech, the entire problem of discursive fictionality can be assessed by examining the relationship between these authors and their own narration. Before we can apply this formula to a certain play text, we must first address the fact that Cohn's model, like so much of classical narratology, was not designed with drama and theater in mind. For this reason, we now must ask, what is a narrator in this aesthetic context of theater and or drama? As always, this has been the subject of a long debate within the field, stemming from the fact that some of its earliest contributors defined its disciplinary parameters precisely by excluding drama from the domain of narrative. This position was defended on the grounds that drama, in the pure sense, is a, quote, story without a storyteller, end quote, Scholes and Kellogg, and being one primary example of this source, with the necessary presence of both story and teller being prefigured into their definitions of narrative. We do not have nearly enough time to do justice to the complexities of this debate in such a short presentation. Suffice it to say, it has been refuted from numerous perspectives by numerous theorists since as early as the 1980s. I offer my own contribution to this debate in the form of a fourfold typology of narrators, as they appear in works of drama and theater. The four narratorial candidates proposed by this model are 1. Didascalia or stage directions, 2. Extradiegetic narrators, 3. All speaking figures, and 4. Performers. For reasons of time, I will focus only on the latter two, which will be sufficient for discussing the non-fictionality of a play like 887. All speaking figures, or SN in this mathematical formula, refers to treating any and every character who speaks over the course of the play as a narrator in their own right. These characters' speech, regardless of whether or not it consists of a single character's monologue or interpersonal dialogue between multiple SN figures, is the primary vehicle through which a play's narrative is conveyed, making it functionally equivalent to the more traditional model of narration found in novels. Alternatively, the performers, or PN, are exactly what they sound like, the real individual or individuals who enact the narrative when it is presented in the form of a theatrical production. For the record, I do this formulation a lot more justice in the complete dissertation than I'm able to give it here. The purpose of redefining narrator along these lines is to enable us to substitute these uniquely dramaturgical and theatrical agents into the N position of our Cohn-inspired fictionality equation of A equals N. This provides us with two advantageous templates for assessing whether or not a play is fictional. Employing SN for this purpose allows us to investigate this for a written play text. Playwriting is considered fictional when the playwright composes speech for SN figures other than one representing herself. Because this describes the vast majority of dramatic writing, we can here see the basis upon which fiction is considered to be the default state of drama. Non-fictionality can therefore only be achieved by presenting SN figures that represent the playwright, or by quoting verbatim from original sources whenever depicting another. The latter of these strategies should be recognizable as the modus operandi of documentary theater, which allows that genre to meet the standards of non-fictionality, at least when it is done well. Employing PN, then, is the means for assessing the non-fictionality of a theatrical performance. The performance is considered fictional when a character is portrayed by somebody other than its actual historical referent. Because this is typically what is understood as acting, here we can see the basis upon which fiction is considered to be the default state of theater. Non-fictionality can therefore be achieved by having every onstage PN figure playing herself. There is, however, one significant caveat in this, that being that PN equals A only results in a non-fictional performance when the standard of SN equals A has already been met. There are several interconnected reasons for why this is the case, but there is one that should be immediately obvious. We can all surely think of examples of plays wherein the playwright appears on stage to perform in their own text, but the character they are playing is not the author, and therefore breaks this equation. To use a popular recent example, more popular now than even when I first conceived this paper, author Lin-Manuel Miranda appears on stage as the actor in the original Broadway run of the musical Hamilton. But the role he played, Alexander Hamilton, or the character, is based upon a historical reference that is decidedly not himself. Ergo, A equals PN, but the two do not equal C. For the record, the non-fictionality of this case remains true, regardless of whether we are applying the PN or SN as our lens, as demonstrated by the fact that the same situation with Miranda and Hamilton can be rewritten as A does not equal SN equals C. In both cases, the discrepancy lies in the mutual inequation of author and character, and because SN and character are usually so closely linked, we see the essentialness of SN as our primary source before we can move on to PN in theatrical performance. With this theoretical underpinning in mind, we may begin to analyze 887 as an exemplar of non-fictional theater. Premiering in 2015, 887 is a solo performance by Robert Lepage and Ex Machina, in which he autobiographically recounts his experiences growing up in Quebec City during the Quiet Revolution and the FLQ crisis. Presented as a series of nonlinear vignettes, the performance is loosely framed by a narrative about his difficulties memorizing Michel Lalonde's 1968 poem Speak White for an upcoming public performance. Regardless of whether or not it is a conscious choice by Lepage, practically every scene in this play can be represented algebraically in the form of Sn equals A, as per our equation. This is certainly facilitated by the autobiographical nature of the piece, which makes Robert the most central character as it concerns Sn, and himself being the only performer to appear on stage for Pn. In fact, this conflation of the real-world Robert and the on-stage character Robert is masterfully handled in the first few moments of the play. He enters the stage while the house lights are still up, greeting the audience, going over house rules about cell phone usage, presenting the land acknowledgement, and casually explaining the impetus for the show that, quote, will begin in just a few minutes, end quote. Note the use of future tense, suggesting that it has not yet begun at this point. The lights slowly fade as he continues speaking, making it impossible to pinpoint an exact moment when the prologue ends. When the prologue ends and the performance proper begins. The Robert who tells us about his inspiration for this show is the same Robert who remains on stage until its end. This is not, I believe, what Carol Martin would describe as, quote, a rude eruption of the real into the play, end quote, but more accurately a pragmatic indicator that the real and the play are to be taken here as one and the same. While sustaining the equation of A and its two ends, it is easy enough to manage, while sustaining the equation of A and its two ends is easy enough to manage while monologuing about oneself. What I find to be most impressive about 887 is how Lepage handles the inclusion of other characters while sustaining this narratological balancing act. One would assume that interpersonal dialogue between two characters would necessitate the piece becoming discursively fictional, unless the actual referent of the second speaker has authored their own lines, whether in collaborative role as a co-playwright or if quoted from external sources. Lepage has found a third option, which he uses to dramatize the character of Fred. Fred is first mentioned in the scene titled The Library, when Robert calls him on the telephone to request his help as a rehearsal coach for memorizing the poem Speak White. In this scene, Fred's voicemail does all the talking, making for some humorous banter between the overly verbose Robert and an uncomprehending machine that will not let him finish what he has to say. 2 scenes later, titled Rehearsal Coach, Fred visits Robert's apartment to work on the poem. It is here revealed that Fred will be staged by the absence of a body and voice on stage, with Robert spending the entire scene speaking to nobody. The dialogue is conducted with silent pauses between each of Robert's lines, offering just enough contextual clues for the audience to suss out what Fred might be saying. This is a clever loophole for circumventing the potential inequation of A from both SN and PN. If Fred were given vocalized lines, even if communicated entirely via voiceover, as is so often done in solo theater, then Lepage's presumed authorship over the text would come into direct conflict with the character's narration thereof. On a brief aside, I would be remiss if I did not mention here that Robert tells the audience that Fred, quote, has a fabulous voice, end quote, leading him to pursue a career in radio. I am thoroughly amused by the irony of this being the character whose voice the audience never gets to hear. Similarly, if a second actor were to appear on stage to play Fred, as would be the expected mode in regular dramatic theater, then the scene would become likewise fictionalized, unless, of course, that performer was the actual Fred whom Lepage knew from his days in theater school. In both hypotheticals, N would not equal A. In depicting this character in a way that requires neither spoken discourse nor corporeal presence, Lepage has successfully staged a scene of dialogue between the author and another figure without falling into either of the common pitfalls of attempting non-fictional dialogue in a theatrical performance. This is not to say that Lepage does not occasionally employ verbatim citations to much the same effect. One notable example is in the scene titled Parc des Braves numéro 2, dramatizing Charles de Gaulle's famous visit to Quebec in 1967. While de Gaulle's physical presence is manifested with a wooden puppet sitting atop Lepage's shirt pocket, the discourse of his historic Vive le Québec Libre speech is conveyed via an archival audio clip from the original event. As a result, A equals S and P by virtue of de Gaulle's words being spoken and performed by its long-deceased historical referent. This scenario can be viewed as the inversion of several of the other characters, who, like Fred, are given no voice, but whose absent bodies are given visual presence, primarily through the uses of dolls and projections. For example, most of the residents of 887 Murray Avenue are projected as forms onto the windows of the scale model of the building. The same is done with Robert's sister Linda in the bunk bed scene, who was visualized as an unspeaking silhouette projected onto the hanging sheet. Without voices and actual bodies, these characters lack any discernible SN or PN that could have otherwise been discontinuous with their authorship. Which brings me to one of the most important characters in the entire show, one whose mode of staging potentially complicates the play's non-fictional machinery as I have described it thus far, that being Robert's father. There are two ways in which this figure appears in the play. The first is metonymically by the appearance of his taxicab. Functionally, this is no different than the puppet of de Gaulle, the projections of Linda and the neighbors, or even the equally metonymical boots of a soldier in the paperboy scene. It is a silent object that symbolizes the character without any need for SN or PN. Difficulties arise when we examine other means of staging Robert's father. Two scenes, Snack Bar and the concluding Taxi in the Garage, in which Lepage himself embodies the role, donning the taxi driver's hat and glasses. Being consistent with the play's pattern of SN always equaling A, this character never speaks, despite Robert insisting that, quote, only someone like him would have the authority to read these words, end quote, in reference to Speak White. However, by physically playing the role of somebody other than himself, Lepage would appear to be committing a fictionalizing state of A equals PN, which doesn't equal C. This formulation may be familiar, as it is the above referenced scenario of Lin-Manuel Miranda not actually being Alexander Hamilton. As natural as this might seem in virtually any other theatrical production, there is something to be said for such a deviation here. So much of the pieces appear to be meticulously designed to uphold aspects of A equals N, only to have this one element, comprised of no more than a total of 3 minutes of stage time, seem to disregard its own fictionalist implications. I am of two minds with regards to how we might interpret this. On one hand, because this character does not speak, the text as a whole continues to meet the discursive requirements of A equals SN, non-fictionality from beginning to end. There is an acceptable school of thought that the discursive level subordinates the performance level as it concerns non-fictional playwriting. This is by the same logic that something like the Laramie Project, for example, is acceptably non-fictional, even though the actors from the Tectonic Theater Project are not themselves the citizens of Laramie whom they quote verbatim on stage. From this perspective, enacting others is simply par for the course of the theatrical medium and is not a de facto invalidation of what otherwise appears to be fully non-fictional. On the other hand, if we insist on a PN-centric view of performance's fictionality, then we have little choice but to accept that Lepage disrupts his own well-established conventions of non-fictionality in order to evoke a symbolic equivalence between his father and himself. I would argue that doing so causes the non-fictional frame to bend but not break completely, as it remains clear throughout these scenes that Robert is play-acting as his father, with little to no attempt at any mimetic illusion. There's the equation there. By way of conclusion, if there is a lesson we can take from having undergone this exercise, it is this. Non-fictional theater is surprisingly difficult to produce. I would argue that this is the primary reason for the default fictionality that has characterized works produced in this medium for so much of its history. A playwright crafting a work of fiction has the freedom to write whatever lines they want, attribute them to whatever characters they want, and have it performed by any potential actors they want. Without the weight of a guiding truth claim, nothing is off limits. A playwright attempting to craft a work of nonfiction has more discursive considerations to be conscious of throughout the process. There are countless steps along the way wherein a single misstep can call the veracity of the entire enterprise into question. Even a play like 87, which comes so close to checking every box, still appears to stumble moments before the finish line. A pessimistic view of this can call into question whether or not attempting non-fictional theater is even worth the trouble. If one truly desires to communicate a message non-fictionally, other media have more long-standing traditions of being successfully employed for this task. Print, for example, has long been the most effective means, whether the narrative being conveyed is a historical chronicle, journalistic reportage, or even a more traditional autobiography. Documentary filmmaking as well has conventions of non-fictionality well established and easily interpretable as such by an audience. In either case, the distributional reach of the narrative can be extended well beyond the theater's limited parameters of time and space. Much of these critiques seem difficult to dispute. One person's pessimism is, in fact, another's pragmatism. That said, I think there is something remarkable about 887's approach to non-fictionality. It might not necessarily meet all of its standards to everyone's satisfactions, but seeing the attempt unfold and understanding how each element clicks into place is impressive for its own sake. While it is truly rare to encounter a play that makes such a concerted effort towards achieving non-fictional status, our distillation of the narratological criteria that is required for such status illustrates that such work is in fact possible, so long as the necessary efforts are made to transcend the medium's default position. Thank you.